In April 1904, in a private room at a Paris hotel, two men sat across from each other at a table. One was a Japanese banker named Takahashi Korekiyo, deputy governor of the Bank of Japan. The other was a German-born American banker named Jacob Schiff, head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the most powerful investment banks on Wall Street. They were about to make a deal that would change the course of history. Takahashi needed money. His country, Japan, was about to go to war with the Russian Empire, one of the largest and most powerful nations on Earth. Japan needed to buy weapons, ammunition, ships, everything required to fight a modern war, and they needed someone to finance it. Schiff had money. More importantly, he had a vendetta. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, presided over a regime that brutally oppressed its Jewish population. Pogroms, violence, systematic persecution. Schiff had watched from America as Russian Jews were beaten, killed, driven from their homes, and he had vowed to do something about it. Now, sitting across from this Japanese banker, he saw his opportunity. "I will lend you $200 million, Schiff said. It was an audacious sum, equivalent to over $5 billion today. It would provide approximately half the funds Japan needed for its entire war effort, and it would help bring down the Tsar's empire." This is the story of how a Jewish banker from Frankfurt, driven by a personal hatred of antisemitism, used the power of capitalism to wage war against one of history's most oppressive regimes. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun, it's a loan. Jacob Heinrich Schiff was born on January 10, 1847, in the Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto, of Frankfurt am Main, Germany. The Judengasse was a narrow street where Frankfurt's Jews were required to live, separated from the rest of the city. It was crowded, dirty, and degrading, but it was also home to some of the most distinguished Jewish families in Europe. Jacob's father, Moses Schiff, worked as a broker for the Rothschild family, the most powerful Jewish banking dynasty in the world. Moses came from a long line of rabbis and scholars. The Schiff family could trace its lineage in Frankfurt back to 1370. One ancestor, David Tavella Schiff, had been the lead rabbi of the London synagogue from 1765. Another relative, Meir ben Jacob Schiff, had been a renowned Talmudic scholar in the 14th century. This wasn't just any Jewish family. This was Jewish aristocracy, as much as such a thing could exist in a ghetto. Young Jacob grew up surrounded by books, learning, and business. His father taught him about banking and finance. He learned how money moved, how deals were structured, how relationships were built. His mother, Clara, taught him about Jewish tradition and the importance of charity. But Jacob also learned something else growing up in the Judengasse. He learned what it meant to be a Jew in a world that hated Jews. He learned about restrictions, about persecution, about living as a second-class citizen in your own country. He watched as his father, despite his brilliance and his connections to the Rothschilds, was confined to a narrow street. From childhood, his parents instilled in him a principle from the Talmud. Kindness was the keynote of the household, Jacob would later recall. It was made our duty to put 1/10 aside for charity, according to the old Jewish tradition. It was the principle of tzedakah, the obligation to give to those in need. Not charity as an act of kindness, but charity as a moral duty. It was a principle he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In 1861, at age 14, Jacob began working as an apprentice in the banking and brokerage business in Frankfurt. He was bright, ambitious, and hardworking. He learned quickly. He studied how his father structured deals for the Rothschilds. He learned the mechanics of finance, how loans were syndicated, how risk was assessed, how capital was deployed. He watched how the great banking houses of Europe operated, but he also learned the limitations. No matter how skilled he became, no matter how much he learned, he would always be confined by his Jewishness. In Frankfurt, there were ceilings he could never break through. By 1865, after the American Civil War had ended, Jacob made a decision that would change his life. He would leave Germany and go to America. Why America? The opportunities were greater. The restrictions on Jews were fewer. In America, Jacob believed, a man could rise as high as his talents would take him, regardless of his religion. It was the immigrant's dream, the belief that in the New World, merit mattered more than birth. On August 6, 1865, 18-year-old Jacob Schiff arrived in New York City. He spoke German and Yiddish, but his English was limited. He had some connections through his father's business relationships, but he was essentially starting from scratch. For the first few months, he was unemployed. He walked the streets of New York, looking for work, trying to understand this new country. He found work as a clerk at a brokerage and threw himself into learning the American financial system. It was different from Europe, more aggressive, more open, more willing to take risks. By November 1866, he had established himself enough to open his own brokerage. He was 19 years old. In 1867, he joined the firm of Budge, Schiff and Company. He was building a reputation. People were starting to know his name. In September 1870, he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. But America wasn't quite the promised land he had hoped for. Antisemitism existed here too, though it was more subtle than in Europe. Jews were excluded from certain clubs, certain neighborhoods, certain business opportunities. The doors were more open than in Frankfurt, but they weren't fully open. In 1872, discouraged by the limitations he still faced, Jacob decided to return to Germany. He became manager of the Hamburg branch of the London and Hanseatic Bank. When his father died in 1873, he returned to Frankfurt to be with his family. It seemed like his American dream was over. He had tried, he had worked hard, he had built a business, but in the end, the barriers were still there. Then, in 1874, Jacob received a letter that would change everything. Abraham Kuhn, co-founder of the banking firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company in New York, invited Jacob to return to America and join the firm. It was an extraordinary opportunity. Kuhn, Loeb and Company was one of the most prestigious investment banks in the United States, rivaling even J.P. Morgan and Company. They financed railroads, industrial companies, and government projects. The firm had been founded in 1867 by Abraham Kuhn and Solomon Loeb, who had made their fortune in wholesale clothing in Cincinnati during the Civil War. The Union Army's demand for blankets had made them wealthy. They had taken that capital and moved to New York to start an investment bank, dealing primarily in government bonds. But by 1874, they were looking to expand. They needed someone with European connections, someone who understood international finance, someone with ambition and vision. Jacob accepted immediately. In January 1875, he returned to New York and joined Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He brought with him valuable connections to European banks: Sir Ernest Cassell in London, Robert Fleming in Scotland, Edouard Notzlin at the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas. These weren't just contacts. These were relationships built over years. These were the channels through which capital flowed across the Atlantic. On May 6, 1875, Jacob married Therese Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, the firm's co-founder. It was both a love match and a strategic alliance. Jacob was now family. The couple had 2 children, a son, Mortimer, and a daughter, Frida. When Jacob joined Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the firm operated in the traditional manner. They waited for clients to approach them with proposals. It was the respectable thing to do, the dignified approach. Jacob changed that. He believed in aggressive pursuit of new business. He believed in seeking out opportunities rather than waiting for them to come to you. He believed in taking risks. The other partners, recognizing his financial genius, began following his lead. Well before Schiff was made head of the firm in 1885, he was seen as the strategist and spokesman for Kuhn Loeb. A partner observed, he could conceive financial transactions of gigantic lines, but at the same time, no business detail escaped his attention. This was Jacob's gift. He could see the big picture, the massive railroad reorganizations, the $100 million loans, the reshaping of American industry. But he could also focus on the details, the specific terms of a bond issue, the precise structure of a syndicate, the individual clauses in a contract. And in 1885, just 10 years after joining the firm, Jacob Schiff became the head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He would remain so for over 4 decades. Over the next 2 decades, Jacob Schiff built Kuhn, Loeb and Company into one of the most powerful financial institutions in America. His primary focus was railroads. In the late 19th century, railroads were the infrastructure of the nation. They connected coasts, opened territories, enabled commerce. Financing railroads meant financing America's future. Schiff financed the Pennsylvania Railroad, providing them with $500 million over a quarter century. It was a long-term relationship built on trust and consistent performance. He financed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, multiple other lines across the country. But his most significant achievement was the reorganization of the Union Pacific Railroad. In 1893, an economic panic swept through America. Banks failed, companies collapsed, and many railroads, which had been built on speculation and corruption, were exposed as financially unstable. The Union Pacific Railroad was one of them. It was drowning in debt, poorly managed, on the verge of collapse. Schiff saw an opportunity. He formed a reorganization committee that included the National City Bank and Rockefeller money. But unlike most bankers, who would structure a deal and then step back, Schiff took on the all-consuming task of hands-on manager. He didn't just provide capital, he restructured operations, he replaced management, he renegotiated contracts, he rebuilt the railroad from the ground up. It was exhausting work. It required his attention every day for months, but Schiff believed that if you were going to put your name on something, you had to make sure it was done right. Then, in 1894, he heard that Edward H. Harriman was trying to block the reorganization. Harriman was a railroad magnate who wanted to add the Union Pacific to his own empire. Most bankers would have fought him. Schiff negotiated with him. They struck an agreement. Harriman would get a position on the executive board, and Kuhn, Loeb, would have access to his credit reserves. It was a partnership built on mutual benefit. In 1897, Schiff convinced the U.S. government to provide $87 million to allow his investment group to take full possession of the line. The Union Pacific prospered. It became one of the most profitable railroads in America, and Schiff had proven something important. He could not only finance railroads, he could save them. But Schiff's greatest test came in the battle for control of Western railroads. By the turn of the century, there were several titans fighting for dominance. Jacob Schiff and Edward H. Harriman on one side, James J. Hill and J.P. Morgan on the other. These weren't just business rivals. These were some of the most powerful men in America, fighting for control of an industry that was literally building the infrastructure of a nation. In 1900, Schiff and Harriman tried to acquire the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad for the Union Pacific. It was a strategic line that would give them access to Chicago, the hub of American commerce. But Hill and Morgan wanted it for the Northern Pacific, which they now owned. They won the bid. Schiff and Harriman didn't accept defeat. They began buying Northern Pacific stock on the open market. If they couldn't buy the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy directly, they would buy the company that owned it. On May 9, 1901, the price of Northern Pacific stock shot up to $1,000 per share as both sides frantically bought. The sudden spike caused panic in the broader market. Other stocks crashed as investors sold everything to cover their Northern Pacific positions. It was financial warfare on a scale America had never seen. Finally, the two sides brokered a truce. The price fell back to $150. The agreement gave board seats to the non-owners and promised to minimize competition between the lines. But the message was clear. Jacob Schiff could go toe-to-toe with J.P. Morgan and hold his own. By 1901, Kuhn, Loeb was in control of 22,000 miles of railway and held stock worth $321 million, equivalent to $9.3 billion today. Schiff was regarded as second only to Morgan in the investment banking world, but Schiff's influence extended beyond railroads. He financed industrial companies, American Smelting and Refining Company, Westinghouse Electric, Western Union Telegraph. He became a director of the National City Bank of New York, the Equitable Life Assurance Society, Wells Fargo and Company. He sat on multiple boards. He advised presidents of companies. He shaped American capitalism. By the turn of the century, Jacob Schiff was one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. He was wealthy beyond measure, respected by his peers, feared by his competitors. He had achieved the American dream. The immigrant from the Frankfurt ghetto had become one of the titans of American finance. But he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what it meant to be a Jew in a world that hated Jews, and he never forgot the suffering of his people in Russia. While Jacob Schiff was building his empire in America, Jews in the Russian Empire were living through a nightmare. Tsar Nicholas II, who came to power in 1894, presided over a regime of systematic anti-Semitism. Jews were restricted to living in the Pale of Settlement, a region that included parts of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. They were barred from most professions, from owning land, from attending universities. More than half the Jews in the world lived in Russia, and they lived under constant threat. But the restrictions were just the beginning. The real horror came in the form of pogroms, organized massacres of Jewish communities. In April 1903, during Passover, one of the worst pogroms in history occurred in the city of Kishinev. Kishinev was a sleepy city on the southwestern border of Imperial Russia. It was the provincial capital of Bessarabia, a rural region where there were scarcely 100 miles of paved roads. It was a place of fruit and hides and splendid wines. Jews comprised half the city's population and had lived in seeming peace with their Christian neighbors. On April 8, 1903, Easter Sunday, a mild disturbance against local Jews rattled the city. Little property was destroyed. The outbreak seemed like nothing more than a bacchanal of rowdy teenagers. But the next day, and for half the next, violence escalated. Gangs of 10 or 20, armed with hatchets and knives, stormed through the town's narrow streets and into its courtyards. Jewish families defended themselves with garden implements and other meager weapons. In the end, 49 Jews were killed. An untold number of Jewish women were raped. 1,500 Jewish homes were damaged. Children were murdered in front of their parents. The Tsar's government did nothing to stop it. In fact, many believed the government had encouraged it. The violence had been prompted by rumors of Jewish ritual murder, the ancient blood libel that Jews killed Christian children for their blood. The rumors had been spread by Pavel Krushevan, a local newspaper editor who would later become known as the reputed editor of The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the infamous anti-Semitic forgery. News of the Kishinev pogroms spread around the world within days. Jewish communities everywhere were horrified. Protests were held in major cities. Newspapers condemned the violence. The pogrom became a talisman of imperial Russian brutality against its Jews. It brought the word pogrom to the world stage, and it set off reverberations that would change the course of Jewish history for the next century. Jacob Schiff didn't just protest, he acted. He used his position as one of the most powerful bankers in America to impose a personal sanction on the Russian Empire. He issued a decree within Kuhn, Loeb and Company. No funds from any of their loans would go to Russia. Not $1 would support the Tsarist regime. It was an extraordinary act of defiance. Russia was a major power, a potential source of lucrative business. Kuhn, Loeb could have made millions financing Russian railways, Russian industries, Russian government bonds. But Schiff didn't care about the money. He cared about justice. He wrote letters to the Tsar, demanding an end to the persecution of Jews. He lobbied the US government to pressure Russia. He funded relief efforts for pogrom victims. He used every tool at his disposal, his wealth, his connections, his influence, to fight back against the Tsarist regime. But it wasn't enough. The pogroms continued. The Tsar ignored his pleas. Schiff needed a bigger weapon. In 1904, tensions between Russia and Japan erupted into war. The conflict was over control of Manchuria and Korea, but it represented something larger, a clash between an old European empire and a rising Asian power. Japan was a small country with a developing economy. They had modernized rapidly after the Meiji Restoration, building a modern military and industrial base, but they lacked the financial resources to sustain a long war against Russia, one of the largest empires on Earth. They needed to buy weapons, ammunition, ships, and supplies, and they needed someone to finance it. Takahashi Korekiyo, the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan, was sent to Europe to secure loans. He approached banks in London and Paris, but most were hesitant. Russia was a major power with a huge army. Japan was an underdog. Lending to Japan seemed like a risky bet. What if Japan lost? The bonds would be worthless. Bank after bank turned him down. Then Takahashi met Jacob Schiff. The meeting took place in April 1904 in Paris. Schiff listened as Takahashi explained Japan's situation. They needed $200 million. It was an enormous sum, but without it, Japan couldn't fight the war. Schiff asked one question: will any of this money go to Russia? No, Takahashi said. We are fighting Russia. Schiff smiled. Then I will give you the loan. Takahashi was stunned. He had been turned down by bank after bank, and now this American banker was agreeing to finance half of Japan's war effort. May I ask why? Takahashi said. Schiff's expression hardened. The Tsar's regime is murdering my people. I have tried every other way to stop it. Now I will use my money to help defeat him. It was personal. This wasn't just business. This was revenge. The loan was structured through Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and syndicated to other banks. It was the first major flotation of Japanese bonds on Wall Street, and it attracted worldwide attention. Schiff structured the loan in multiple tranches. The first issue was for $200 million. A second issue of £12 million, $60 million, was secured by a second lien. As the war continued, Schiff floated additional bonds. In total, Kuhn, Loeb provided approximately $200 million, equivalent to over $5.6 billion today. It provided approximately half the funds Japan needed for its entire war effort. The risk was enormous. If Japan lost, the bonds would default. Kuhn, Loeb, would lose hundreds of millions. Schiff's reputation would be destroyed. But Schiff believed in the cause, and he believed that Russia, despite its size, was weaker than it appeared. With Schiff's money, Japan was able to import massive quantities of munitions and supplies. They built up their navy, equipped their army, and prepared for a war that most of the world expected them to lose. And then something remarkable happened. Japan won. On May 27-28, 1905, the Japanese Navy decisively defeated the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. The Russians lost almost their entire fleet. 21 ships sunk, 7 captured. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. It was a massacre. On land, Japanese forces defeated Russian armies in Manchuria. The war that everyone had expected Russia to win easily had turned into a humiliating defeat. In September 1905, the two nations signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the war. Japan had achieved its objectives. Russia had been humiliated, and Jacob Schiff had played a crucial role in making it happen. The victory sent shockwaves around the world. For the first time, an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a modern war. It challenged assumptions about race, about power, about the inevitability of European dominance. It showed that the old empires were vulnerable, that the world order was changing. In Japan, Schiff was hailed as a hero. In 1905, he was awarded the Order of the Sacred Treasure. In 1907, he received the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star, the second highest honor in Japan. He was the first foreigner to receive the order in person from Emperor Meiji in the Imperial Palace. He also had a private audience with King Edward VII of the United Kingdom, who wanted to understand how this American banker had helped reshape the balance of power in Asia. But for Schiff, the greatest satisfaction came from what happened in Russia. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War devastated Russia. The Tsar's regime, already unpopular, lost what little legitimacy it had left. The military was humiliated. The economy was in shambles. In 1905, revolution broke out across Russia. Workers went on strike. Peasants revolted. Even parts of the military mutinied. The Tsar managed to hold on to power, but barely. He was forced to create a parliament, the Duma, and grant limited reforms. But the empire was weakened, unstable, teetering on the edge of collapse. 12 years later, in March 1917, the Tsar was overthrown. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, came to an end. Jacob Schiff's loan to Japan hadn't single-handedly caused the fall of the Tsar, but it had been a significant factor. The defeat in the war had exposed the regime's weakness, had emboldened its opponents, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to revolution. Schiff had used capitalism as a weapon. He had turned money into a tool for justice, and he had helped bring down one of history's most anti-Semitic regimes. When the Tsar was overthrown in March 1917, Schiff believed that the oppression of Russia's Jews would finally end. The new provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, declared Jews to be equal citizens. Schiff was elated. He issued a statement celebrating the revolution. He used both his personal wealth and the resources of Kuhn, Loeb and company to float large loans to Kerensky's government. Finally, he thought, Russia would be free. Finally, his people would be safe. But then, in November 1917, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky seized power in the Bolshevik Revolution. Schiff immediately rejected them. He cut off all loans. He started funding anti-Bolshevik groups. He even demanded that the Bolsheviks pay back the money he had loaned to Kerensky. Schiff's opposition to Russia had always been about anti-Semitism, not about politics. He had no sympathy for socialism or communism. When the Bolsheviks took power, he saw them as just another threat to stability and order. It was a reminder that Schiff's worldview was complex. He was a champion of Jewish rights, but he was also a capitalist who believed in the existing social order. He would use his wealth to fight anti-Semitism, but he wouldn't support revolutionary movements that threatened the system that had made him wealthy. While Schiff was building his banking empire and waging financial war against the Tsar, he was also giving away a fortune. He believed deeply in the Jewish principle of tzedakah, the obligation to give to those in need. He donated to nearly every major Jewish cause in America. He founded the Jewish Industrial Removal Office, which relocated Jewish immigrants from crowded New York City to opportunities in the western United States. Thousands of Jewish families were given the chance to start new lives in places where they could thrive. He established an additional point of immigrant entry through Galveston, Texas, helping thousands of Jews escape persecution in Europe. By creating an alternative to Ellis Island, he helped distribute Jewish immigration across the country. He supported relief efforts for victims of pogroms in Russia. He helped establish Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Jewish Division of the New York Public Library, and the American Jewish Committee. He was president of the Montefiore Home for Chronic Invalids. He funded the Young Men's Hebrew Association building. But Schiff's philanthropy wasn't limited to Jewish causes. He also gave generously to secular American institutions, the Boy Scouts of America, the Harvard Semitic Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. On his 70th birthday, he distributed $700,000 among various charitable organizations. He believed in a Talmudic principle: twice blessed is he who gives in secret. He refused to allow his name to be attached to the buildings he sponsored, with one exception, the Schiff Pavilion at Montefiore Hospital. He never discussed the size of his gifts. Because of his secrecy, the exact amount of his philanthropic donations is impossible to calculate, but historians estimate it was between $50 and $100 million, an astronomical sum for the time. Jacob Schiff died on September 25, 1920, at the age of 73. He had lived long enough to see the Tsar overthrown, to see the Russian Empire collapse, to see the end of World War I. In the tributes that followed his death, people talked about his financial genius, his role in building American railroads, his philanthropy. But perhaps his most significant legacy was what he had done to the Tsar's empire. Schiff had proven that money could be a weapon, that a banker could wage war as effectively as any general, that capitalism, properly wielded, could be a force for justice. He had taken the oppression of his people personally, and he had used every tool at his disposal, his wealth, his connections, his influence, to fight back. The loan to Japan was one of the most audacious financial moves in history, $200 million to help an underdog nation defeat a major power. It was risky, controversial, and driven by personal vendetta, and it worked. There's something deeply satisfying about Jacob Schiff's story. He was born in a ghetto, in a city where Jews were second-class citizens. He grew up watching his people suffer under persecution and violence, and then he became one of the most powerful men in the world, and he used that power to strike back at the regime that had tormented his people. He didn't do it with violence. He didn't do it with revolution. He did it with money. He financed Japan's war against Russia. He helped weaken the Tsar's empire. He lived to see the Romanov dynasty fall. It was revenge, served cold, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Schiff's story also illustrates the unique position of Jewish immigrants in America. They came from places where they had been persecuted, restricted, treated as outsiders. In America, they found opportunity. They built businesses, made fortunes, gained influence, and then they used that influence to help Jews who were still suffering in the old country. Schiff's loan to Japan wasn't just about defeating Russia. It was about proving that Jews didn't have to be victims, that they could fight back, that they could use the tools of capitalism, the very system that had made them successful, as weapons against oppression. From the Judengasse of Frankfurt to the pinnacle of Wall Street, from a broker's son to one of the most powerful bankers in the world, from a man who watched his people suffer to a man who helped bring down their oppressor. This is the story of Jacob Schiff, a Jewish banker who turned money into justice, who proved that sometimes the most effective way to fight tyranny isn't with guns, but with loans, who showed that capitalism, for all its flaws, could be wielded as a weapon for the oppressed. The Tsar thought he was invincible. He thought he could murder Jews with impunity. He thought no one could touch him. He was wrong, because on the other side of the world, a Jewish banker from Frankfurt was writing a check, and that check would help bring down an empire.